Hey everyone, Utkarsh from Spirit Bell Games here. On this channel, we've had a lot of design discussions over the past half year, and it hasn't just been me telling you things, it's also been all of you writing interesting and insightful comments down in the videos, on Patreon, and on Reddit. So now feels like a good time to do a checkpoint when I look back at the past videos and your comments that in some cases changed my mind and in some cases crystallized the ideas in more refined ways. So these are comments of 2025. I won't say like the best comments or my favorite comments, just comments that I think you can get some value out of as well. In some cases, I will read the comments out loud, and in other cases, I'll just display it on the screen. Now, before I start with the specific insightful comments, just want to give a shout out to Saeed Luis and Jason on Reddit and then on Patreon and YouTube respectively for encouraging me in making these design videos. All right, so let's begin with the start of the channel, which was the video exhorting the 3-action turn, commonly called the 3-action economy, but for some reason I felt 3-action turn would be more accessible, so that's why I chose that wording. One of the things that I forgot to mention as a plus point of the 3-action turn is something that Tegan mentioned on YouTube, who says, and I quote, "As a GM, it lets me add in secondary objectives that may cost an action while still allowing my PCs to attack or do something else cool on their turn." End quote. And this, I think, is another strength of the 3-action turn, where when you add a secondary objective, if you don't give it an action cost, if you don't give it an opportunity cost to engage with the secondary objective, then it doesn't feel like there's an interesting decision being made. But if engaging with the secondary objective preempts their entire turn, if the player can't do anything else, then it also feels bad on the player side. And so the 3-action turn allows someone to do a couple of meaningful actions and then still have one or more actions left over to engage with secondary objectives. Tears of Fear brings up the issue of games slowing down due to rolls. If you have 3 actions, you're likely to also have more than just one roll a turn. And as I thought about it, I realized, yes, I generally agree with this. I would like a future system that is streamlined, so maybe it caps out to maximum of 1 roll per action. But as of right now, we have the way that AoEs are designed, for example, you can have 2 actions that cause 5 different saving throw rolls. But of course, that kind of streamlining would have to be done from the ground up. This system is designed with all the enemies rolling for saving throws in mind, because that way you get, as Mathfinder calls it, a multinomial distribution of results. So that works for this game. It could be interesting to see a different game which was designed from the ground up with just a limitation on the number of rolls per turn. Now, there were multiple comments with a common thread. A lot of people said that the system still felt like one main action plus an auxiliary action, and that it didn't truly have 3 equivalent actions. Now, a lot of these comments talked about needing to make like 1 strike or cast a spell on their turn to feel impactful, and then everything else kind of had to fill in. My personal response to this thread became the choose your own action budget video later on. And in that video, I said that while yes, many marshals and casters have prominent 2-action activities, I do think that some classes manage to do 3 roughly equivalent actions. I would put forward the Animist with their focus spells and strikes, and perhaps also I would put forward this Flurry Ranger. But I also think that other classes are designed to take advantage of the full 3 actions within a single turn. And I find that it's because we have this 3-action economy, which has the possibility of having 3 equivalent actions, that you can have this play where some classes do have 3 equivalent actions, some classes have chunking of like 2 actions, and some try to take advantage of all 3. But there is another comment that brought up a different point as a response to this previous thread, which I find intriguing. Artano said in a different video that they also don't see the system being committed to 3 roughly equivalent actions, but instead they see that the system with its 3-action turn is designed to generate the most interesting decision making. When I think about the multiple attack penalty, I would say, yeah, that's fair. So quite a few interesting points raised in that first video itself. The second video was on monster rolls, where I talked about how Pathfinder 2nd Edition did not port over the roll label that D&D 4th Edition had for its monsters. A lot of good discussion on this topic from the community side was around the prescriptive nature of assigning roles and why that may not be a great idea. And I think I mostly agree with these points. I think it would make the game easier to run on the GM side, but it would also feel a little more constrained. But an interesting perspective that I did not think of was provided by Totally Not a Wizard, who provided a counterpoint to my argument where I said that people found roles to be too gamist in 4E. And Totally Not a Wizard said that roles may help increase immersion by assigning behavioral shortcuts to creatures of the wild instead of reducing it. The next video was how I learned to love the spell slot. IKS Lucara talks about how the additions have broadened the kind of mechanics that are available, the magic mechanics that are available to casters. The comment says, quote, "When spell slots were the only game in town, as far as a resource that a caster had available, I didn't care for them. Since then, with scaling cantrips, focus points, and rituals, I'm much more comfortable with them as just one tool in the toolkit." And keeping on this topic of just one tool in the toolkit, Totally Not a Wizard talks about how variety is rewarded in the system and how spell slots feel like a solution and never the solution. I suppose unless you're going up against a wall of force, then you need a disintegrate. And then there is Hellioning's comment on Reddit, which reveals a failure in my communication. The comment said that the video title made them think that I had come to love relying on spell slots as my primary approach to the game, whereas my video talked about a particular character build where I learned to love spell slots as a supplementary tool in my kit instead of a primary tool. Now, I will say that yes, I do like spell slot a lot as a supplementary tool, but I also have played and enjoyed playing a mid-level sorcerer that uses low-level spell slots as their primary tool to engage with combat. And that may have been something useful to describe in the video itself. Okay, next. My GMing tips for prepared casters, where I talked about how there's this heroic style of play that does spontaneous combats, and then there's this Witcher/OSR style of play where player characters can learn about their adversaries and prepare, and that this especially helps out prepared casters. So I talked about GM tips, but also commenters pointed out that players can, and maybe should, pay more attention to the environment, to fights that foreshadow future fights, and also to just the clues embedded in the mission or quest description. That can also help prepared casters prepare for the threats ahead. At the same time, MTPTR talks about another way to combine the spontaneous heroic approach with the prepared Witcher-style approach. Quote, "My current approach, as a general rule of thumb, is to have the most important end/final boss fight to be telegraphed and lean more into the Witcher style that you mentioned, while the day-to-day adventures lean more into the surprise where you don't know what's coming next. I think it makes the end fights feel more cinematic, and partially but not only because it allows me to make them more difficult encounter budget-wise, since my players will be prepared for them, so similar to what you suggested. That way, prepared casters can feel like the heroes in the most important fights," end quote. I completely agree with this, and I think it's a nice way to balance out the two different approaches. So far, I've run either exclusively a heroic game or exclusively a gritty hex crawl Witcher style. but this particular comment makes me want to run this style of combined game. Okay, in the 7 uses for Feats, the recommendation that came near the end, which I think in hindsight may have been most useful because the comments highlighted them, is that Feats should be used not as gatekeeping for improvisation, but rather as improvisation aid. If you think about Feats as upper bound on an improvised action, then something just a little less powerful or with some penalties could be allowed by people who don't have that feat. Something to think about. Next, we come to the skill feats video, where I talk about how one of the complaints people have is that there are too many skill feats, and the other complaint is that the power distribution across skill feats is asymmetric. On Patreon, Kiche mentions that they don't see too many skill feats as an issue, and their comment is insightful about the general design of the game. Keep in mind that they're coming from a perspective of a GM, or at least someone who has GM'd at least one Pathfinder game. Quote, "So much of the character creation system seems designed to allow players to play character concepts without creating non-functional characters. Everything about the character system seems to quietly direct players away from the practice of scrolling through their options in search of the best one, a practice that requires doing a huge series of direct comparisons between feat texts, and instead towards picking feats that support your already existing ideas of who you want your character to be or what you want them to do." Broadly, I agree with this sentiment, as the system does have strong guardrails against building non-functional characters. But also, now that I've made the designer your own action budget video, I think that an understanding of combat skill feats is more important for certain builds, like monks who may end up having more extra actions, whereas other classes like the Magus can make fully roleplay-based decisions on their skill feat selection because they're probably not going to have actions left over for skill actions, which is by design. That's why the Maguses strike when they hit tend to be more powerful than the monks. Now, when it comes to the asymmetry between skills, a lot of people defended Terrified Retreat, which I mentioned in a dismissive tone. And now that I know how good incapacitation skills and abilities and spells are at higher levels of play, I think I've also changed my mind, and I think now, Terrified Retreat is good, which means Intimidation is very good. That said, the video and the comments to it cemented in my mind that performance need not be a general skill available to everyone. I think it can be a non-int lore, something that bards could get an auto-scaling version of, like thaumaturges get esoteric lore. In the video on subsystems, I lamented that skill feats do not tie into subsystems, and so subsystems feel flat. A lot of comments said that there was a mechanical flatness to subsystems, irrespective of whether skill feats tied to them or not. Pumpkin Waffle Art summarized a lot of the sentiments around this topic. Quote, "Normally, Pathfinder 2e has a lot of depth, complex tactical combat, a huge variety of character build options, and interesting ways that you can use skills and skill feats in normal RP scenarios. Whenever I experience these subsystems, mostly chases, research, and downtime point earnings in APs so far, I feel like I'm yanked out of this immersive game and put into a very shallow, simplistic, video gamified situation that doesn't flow well into the rest of PF2E's features. I have several GMs who have all tried to put their own spin on it, narrate to make things seem more epic, etc. At the end of the day, though, when a subsystem comes up, it's like the fun part of the game, either combat or involved acted out RP, grinds to a halt, and we are temporarily placed on a conveyor belt of skill checks. I see what Paizo was trying to do, add a standardized process and rule structure to non-combat activities, but it just seems so flat and boring compared to the rest of the game. When it comes to things like chases and infiltration especially, I think having every person do a skill check for every obstacle just drags things out way too much. Of course, you want to encourage everyone to be involved in the situation, but there has to be a better way." End quote. Speaking of better way, Hemlocksbane provides additional insight as to why subsystems feel flat. Quote, I have two general problems with subsystems, which can be expanded to skill challenges in 4E and both negotiations and montages in Draw Steel, that contribute to why I feel like they don't feel as good at the table as combat. They're one-sided. In most subsystems, the party is competing against time and static DCs. Even if the other side is making rolls, they're abstracted into what is basically a more complicated version of the time obstacle. Without the direct interaction, the encounters feel stale and undynamic. And there is one main means of interaction. Most subsystems basically boil down to making relevant checks to get victory points on each of your turns. Maybe there will be some kind of get more information alternative, but even then, the entire system is a huge funnel towards trying to use skills you're good at and that have the lowest DCs in the challenge. End quote. I think both of these are good insights that have changed my mind on how I'm approaching the overhaul of subsystems. In that video, I talked about how I thought that tying skill feats into the subsystems would be a good way, and that's still part of the overhaul, but it's clear that mechanical changes need to go deeper than just that. That said, JL the King made the only good case for me not integrating skill feats into subsystems. The comment essentially said that subsystems are currently modular and can be ignored during character building, and for the GM if they want to decide to use them or not. But linking subsystems with skill feats could undermine the modularity, the ignorability of subsystems. So when I'm doing my overhaul, I'm still likely to connect the two in my overhaul. I know from this comment that the system will need to be interesting on its own without the involvement of skill feats. Okay, then we come to the first controversial one. A philosopher once said that friction generates both heat and light. And I know that this one generated heat. Now, let's see if it also generated light. Does Pathfinder 2e choose balance over fun, or why I run Pathfinder 2nd Edition? That was the video. And in that, I talked about the tension and tactics that Pathfinder 2e brings to the table and doesn't let character building undercut the tension and tactics. This video got great comments from GM side and for player side, and we're going to go slowly from like GM side over to the player side and see how the comments shift. So let's start with Kadmi's comment. Quote, PF2E's balance has managed to make power more or less equal between various different metrics per level. If you want more power, you increase the level. They haven't balanced out the fun, they've made power reliable. What you do with it is up to you, end quote. And Kiche's comment follows directly from this, again on the GM side, on what the GMs can do with how reliable power has become. Quote, GMs, see a sea of people talking about how great balance is and see people confusing balance with rigid constraints while celebrating it. People who tell them that the game expects them to play it in a certain way, while the actual lead designers are out there championing the flexibility of the system. And in all of that, the very concept of what balance is gets completely and totally beaten down into a pulp. I play this game because I love saying no to guidance and still getting to feel very confident in how things will unfold. Because I get to do things that make my players feel like bosses without it fucking up my whole campaign. Because it provides me a whole toolbox full of tools that I can use whenever I need them and everything I need to manufacture tools of my own. I see this and I fully agree. And this and a lot of other comments that Kiche has put have influenced my own GMing style so that now I am no longer scared of giving my players high-level items that are way beyond their specific level, especially consumables. By making power reliable, the GM can know how much power they're giving to their players and how much overpowered they're making their players. And from here, we come to the bridge comment that bridges are the things on the GM side and on the player side. Kilchrono's comment bridges the appreciation that GMs have for the system with the frustrations that some players have. The whole comment is insightful, so pause the video if you need to read the full text, but I'll focus in on just one excerpt. And that's when it hit me. It's about being the determiner of the power cap. In 3.5, 1E, and 5E, it's very easy for a player running with a GM who runs perfectly neutrally and says, well, it's in the rules, so I'll allow it, to set their own power caps because the rules permissively allow it. You can't do that in Pathfinder 2E. In Pathfinder 2E, it is entirely dependent on the GM to be permissive to those power spikes because the expected baseline is a more level power cap. And this leads to a comment from the player's perspective, where Lars Anderson says, quote, I think that 2E does overbalance things for my personal taste at least, but not because I want to deflate all tension everywhere God Wizard style. Rather, part of what I enjoy in character expression is the chance to choose where the tension lands, and 2E flattens some of the ability to do that relative to 1E, end quote. These comments together were very insightful to me about the system. Players want to be able to deflate the tension, which is something I talk about in that video, but without the GM's permission, they're limited in terms of creating their power spikes. Essentially, what the game's mechanics say to the players is, if you want to feel exceptionally powerful, ask your GM to make an exception for you. And it says to the GMs, if you want your players to feel exceptionally powerful, go outside of the level guidelines when handing out rewards. Implicitly, this is what the game says by its mechanics. Personally, when I consider the vast gamut of games that are played, in-person games, convention games, online West marches, tables that are a mix of new players and experienced ones, you want a system that is sufficiently balanced, that does try and maintain that amount of tension and gives the tension breaking power to the GM, because that allows all of these different games to move forward without any one player dominating. Now, all that said, Fair Family also made an interesting observation that I think a lot of people would agree with, and I think even me from 6 months ago would have agreed with it. Now I'm not too sure, but there's still wisdom in it, where they say that low-level play can suck for spellcasters and dex marshals, though I'll editorialize here and say low-level play can suck for wizards, sorcerers, witches, oracles, and dex marshals. But I believe the point they're trying to make is that when the system wants to show a rise in power over the levels, like for a wizard, then the build has to start out at low power and then get to being balanced with other classes, instead of starting off balanced and then getting to be more powerful than other classes. So for now, I'll leave this comment to stand on its own, as it is pointing at a real experience, and any response I have to it involves the kind of study of the system that a player should not be required or expected to do. Utkarsh from the editing booth here. This video has gotten quite long already, so I'm cutting it off at the almost halfway point, and there'll be a part 2 covering the rest of the comments coming up. If you are on Patreon as a paid member, then you'll get early access to that and future videos. See you at the next one.